In this lesson, you'll learn how to prepare a list of companies for inserting into Salesforce as account records using Data Loader. Technically speaking, the only field required to create a new account is its name, which has a character limit of 255. If your file contains records with name values exceeding this limit, they're automatically truncated. However, you're not notified as to which records were truncated, so you can go back to Excel, use a length formula, and figure it out that way. Here's a link to the list of all native account fields and their configuration details. This list is also included in the account workbook attached to the lesson. This list is helpful as it provides the field API names, which is what we use when we map our data. Every data map in this course uses field API names instead of the field's label. This is so we can go fast and be accurate. By using API names in our mapping, we can take advantage of the auto match feature in Data Loader so we don't have to waste time dragging and dropping. And since API names have to be unique on the object, whereas field labels don't, we can have confidence that we're mapping the right data to the right field, which improves our chances of getting zero errors and prevents rework. Speaking of accuracy, it's important to call out that Salesforce will take pretty much anything you want to give it, meaning it's not a magical cleansing tool. Data cleansing is time consuming and is rarely included in a migration statement of work, so make sure you and your client are clear on what, if any, data cleansing is expected before you begin. Let's talk about some default field behavior. If you don't set an account owner, you become the account owner, which can easily be updated later. However, you can't update the audit fields later, so you can only set the created by and created date when you're inserting new records. If you forget this step and they're critical as part of the statement of work, you have to delete that set of records and re-import them. If you have an historical parent account ID in your file, you'll have to reference this in an update after the initial insert is complete. This lesson doesn't cover person accounts. They're covered in depth in a separate lesson. Let's talk about record types. When preparing our data maps, there are situations where we are referencing other record IDs in Salesforce. In the previous lesson, when you inserted users, you learned two ways to map the user profile and role. A very similar concept applies to record types. In our sample org, we have two account record types created, business and partner. To map using the record type name, set the record type lookup to name in Data Loader step 2b, and in your source file, use the header of record type record type name. To map to the record type ID, you'll skip setting a value for record type in Data Loader step 2b, and in your source file, you'll apply the header of record type ID to your IDs column. To set the account owner user and the created by user, you can either use the legacy ID field on the user object or the user's Salesforce ID. However, you can't map using both of these IDs in a single load. You can see on the screen, you'll get this error that you can't specify both. If you reference legacy IDs that weren't included in your user load, meaning they don't exist in Salesforce, you'll receive this error, which is telling you that, hey, I can't find that foreign external ID. Once you've made your decision, you are ready to set the data loader settings. In this example, you've chosen to map to the legacy ID field on the user object for both the owner ID and the created by ID. So in step 2b of the data loader, you're going to set those lookup values to legacy ID for both created by and owner, and make sure that in your file, you've used the headers of user-legacy ID. Now we're logged into Salesforce, and we'll go step by step through loading companies into Salesforce as accounts. Notice here that we have two account record types, business and partner. Each of these has its own ID, which we can find by either clicking on it, or we can export this whole object into our account workbook. Also notice that we have created a legacy ID field and marked it as an external ID, so we'll be loading the other database's ID into this field. Let's take a look at our account workbook. Inside of our workbook, on the very first tab, we see sample accounts. So this is meant to look and feel like an account file that you would receive from another database backup. The type of record that you see here we can use to either map to a pick list field, or in our case, we are using it to map to our record types. You can see the field header of ID indicates that it came from the other database, and that's the ID it had over there. Same with the owner user and created by user. You can see that these have a different type of user ID than what Salesforce has. So when we loaded user records in the previous lesson, we ported this information into that legacy ID field so that we can now reference it in these subsequent loads. So we grabbed this information from sample accounts and then we pasted it into accounts mapped. This is where we have to make some decisions. First, if we're going to use the business and partner indicator here to map over to our record type, we can choose to either use the data loader setting of mapping by name, or we can bring in the record type ID. Usually, in making this decision, it comes down to whether or not we are using the same naming convention on more than one object. As an example, if we have the record type name of partner and business on both account and, as you can see here, it's on the contact, then we will get a data loader error if we try to map by name, because Salesforce looks across all objects, not just the object we chose when we were inserting new records. In our case, we have different naming convention for our business and partner contact record types, so we are able to map by name in the data loader for this object's record types. We also have to make a decision on referencing the user ID for the owner of the record and the created by user of the record. We can either map to the legacy ID field or the Salesforce user ID field. Scrolling over here, the created date in Salesforce has a date and time field value. So in order to make sure that our source data is formatted correctly, you can click on the Excel formatting tab of the workbook, and you'll notice that in row 2 we have date time, and copy this, and then I click the little X so it doesn't think I'm doing a calculation. Go back to my accounts mapped, select the full column, choose custom in my drop down here and go to more number formats, choose custom again, and here's where I'm going to paste in that format and click OK to apply it to my column. Now I have confidence that this information will go into Salesforce correctly because it has a valid date and time format. Scrolling over to the right, you can see that I took the information I received from the other database, like primary address, and I mapped it to the API name of the corresponding field in Salesforce. And as you know, you can't import a tab of a workbook using data loader. So we grabbed this information from our accounts mapped and we created a CSV file where we pasted that information in and then deleted this original header row as we no longer need it in our final file. So let's go over to data loader, click insert, choose account, and then in our account folder, we're going to grab our prepped CSV file and hit next. Here's where we choose how we want to map in our created by user ID. We're going to choose legacy ID. Owner user, we're going to choose legacy ID again. And record type, we're going to choose name and hit next. Now we're going to auto match our fields to the columns and then double check that everything looks good. So we can see the record type naming matched, the legacy ID field matched, the owner and created by user legacy ID field mapping worked. And scrolling down, we can see everything else mapped that we expected to see mapped in. We'll hit OK and next and make sure that our output folder is set up and ready to go, which it is. We'll click finish, hit yes. And now we can see we have 51 successful inserts and 0 errors. Let's take a look at our success file. And in our folder, our best practice is to rename our success file. And then we'll open it. And then we grab all this data. And then in our account workbook, we'll create a new tab here and paste that information in. And we'll rename this tab Success. And we'll grab that first account ID and then we'll go over to Salesforce and double check that everything mapped in as we expected it to. So after force.com/, we'll paste in that first ID, go to our details tab, and then here's where we would go cell by cell and make sure that everything mapped in exactly as we expected it to. If we needed to insert the parent account IDs, this is when we would go into that success file and we would be able to now reference the ID of the parent record that is corresponding to the non-parent. Now it's your turn. You're going to log into Salesforce, into that free developer org that you created earlier in the course, create business and partner account record types on the account, and then you're going to create your legacy ID field on the account. Then you'll open the account workbook and copy the sample accounts data. And then you'll create a new tab in that workbook where you're going to paste in those sample accounts so that you can practice creating your own map. When you're finished, create a CSV with your map data, log into Data Loader, and insert it. Up next, we'll load contacts.